High-stakes talks taking place in Rome as delegations from Iran and the United States discuss Tehran's nuclear program. Hello, everyone. I'm Asiye Namdar in for Anna Naidu, and you're watching The Heat. Negotiating teams from Iran and the United States met again in Rome on Friday in hopes of ironing out a new deal and removing U.S. sanctions. The two sides are said to be at odds over uranium enrichment. The United States wants Tehran not just to scale back its nuclear program, but stop enriching uranium altogether. A position Iran says is a non-starter. For more, we turn to a former U.S. diplomat and scholar. Ambassador John Limbert served as Deputy Assistant Secretary of State for Iranian Affairs and was held hostage for 444 days during Iran's Islamic Revolution in 1979. He's written extensively on Iranian history and politics and joins us now from New York. Ambassador, good to have you with us on the program.
Thank you, Asiya. Always nice to hear you.
Well, let's talk about negotiations between Iran and the United States. It looks like the fifth round of discussions have ended. Unclear at this point if any real progress was made, but at least it seems neither side here is walking away from talks. Is that by itself a measure of success?
Well, it is, especially in the Iranian-American relationship, which has been so hostile for so long. Anything that is the least bit positive or constructive is probably a good sign.
Well, initially, the Trump administration's position was that Iran can never have a nuclear weapon. Now it has shifted to Iran must give up uranium enrichment altogether, something it did not do, in fact, in the 2015 nuclear deal. I want you to listen to Steve Witkoff, U.S. Special Envoy to the Middle East, and see what he had to say on U.S. networks, which has drawn a lot of criticism from Iranian leaders.
We have one very, very clear red line, and that is enrichment. We cannot allow even 1% of an enrichment capability. We've delivered a proposal to the Iranians that we think addresses some of this without disrespecting them, and so that's important. We want to get to a solution here, and we think that we will be able to. But everything begins from our standpoint, John, with a deal that does not include enrichment. We cannot have that.
Well, this is clearly a problem, a red line for the Iranians. Iran says it has the right to enrich uranium. In fact, it is allowed under the 1968 Non-Proliferation Treaty. It's permitted for energy and medical purposes. Iran's Foreign Minister Abbas Araghchi on Friday put out a tweet, or I should say a statement on X, formerly known as Twitter, and he said, figuring out the path to a deal is not rocket science. Zero nuclear weapons equals we do have a deal. Zero enrichment means we do not have a deal. Time to decide. John, do you see a wiggle room when the two sides are so far apart on uranium enrichment? U.S. says zero uranium enrichment. The Iranians say we have the right to do this, and it's allowed under NPT.
I'll say there's always wiggle room, and as the Rolling Stones say, you can't always get what you want. If you want to make an agreement, and I presume both sides do, the U.S. wants an agreement. President Trump considers himself the world's greatest deal maker, so he wants to show off an agreement. The Iranians want sanctions, relief. They want to show that their diplomacy is paying off. So this is something in negotiation. This is something that the two sides will have to finesse. Now, do they have the ability? Do they have the subtlety to do this? And do they have the patience to do it? There are ways of doing it. I've seen things like a temporary moratorium on enrichment, a swap agreement similar to what the two sides agreed back in 2009. That was during the Burns-Jalili negotiations where uranium would be enriched outside the country and then sent back in. There's a consortium idea. I mean, there's a way of doing this. Question is, do the sides want an agreement? How badly do they want an agreement? And are they willing to negotiate an agreement, or are they going to try? Is one side or the other going to try to bully its way to an agreement?
Well, Trump has repeatedly threatened the military action if a deal is not reached. Now there are reports in U.S. media that Israel is making preparations to hit Iran's nuclear facilities if negotiations go nowhere. How concerning is that if Israel actually goes ahead with this?
Of course, it's concerning. But you remember one thing: President Trump has always emphasized he wants to keep the U.S. out of wars in the Middle East. That was a part of his election platform going back to 2016, and it was a winner for him. And it worked. And he fired his national security advisors and others who were pushing he felt were pushing the U.S. into a conflict with Iran. He doesn't want, enough to make it in one word, he doesn't want a war with Iran. And as far as the Israelis are concerned, maybe they don't want any agreement. I mean, there seems to be Netanyahu's national nightmare is that the U.S. and Iran somehow start talking civilly to each other, responsibly to each other, instead of yelling and screaming and threatening each other. So this is perhaps a threat, but I don't see what the Israelis could do without U.S. backing and U.S. coordination. Perhaps what the Israelis are saying is, look, we're still here, don't forget about us.
And do you think Israeli Prime Minister Benjamin Netanyahu is the kind of leader who would listen to President Trump if Trump said, this is not the time to do this, no strike on Iran?
Well, if the U.S. is not going to back him, I don't see what how much he can do. I mean, the last two, every president, every administration that I've ever worked for or I've ever seen has had as its head of priorities, don't let anyone else drag us into a war with Iran. And that was the bottom line. That was the bottom line for the Obama administration. That was and I think that's the bottom line for the Trump administration.
Ambassador, I gotta ask you about crushing U.S. sanctions that have really devastated Iran's economy. Iranians are struggling. There's high employment, staggering inflation. The value of rial has plummeted. Do these talks perhaps, even though there's no agreement yet, offer hope, some kind of opening to make life easier for the people of Iran?
Well, I certainly hope so. Yeah, I mean, it's very sad, very distressing to see what our Iranian friends are going through, have to put up with in terms of daily life. Now, in a best case, and there is sanction relief and genuine sanction relief. Question that I have is, at the end of the day, with the current administration and your current government in Iran, how much better are things going to be? In other words, how much can you blame the sanctions for people's misery?
You mean also there are
and how
issues
much
of
of it is
mismanagement?
just simple corruption and mismanagement, which has also gone on for a very long time.
Yeah. All right. We're going to leave it there. Ambassador John Limbert, a pleasure to have you on, sir.
My pleasure, Asia. Always nice to hear from you.
For more on the Iran-U.S. nuclear talks, let's bring in our panel. Joining us from New York is Amir Handjani. He's the non-resident fellow at the Quincy Institute for Responsible Statecraft and a security fellow with the Truman National Security Project. Here in Washington is Negar Mortazavi. She's a journalist, political analyst, and editor and host of the Iran Project. And from Tehran, Iran, Satar Sadeghi is an assistant professor with the Faculty of World Studies at the University of Tehran. Welcome to you all. Satar, let me begin with you. What is the general mood among Iranians as these discussions continue?
Well, there is a mixture of optimism and pessimism. I see people who are really looking forward to seeing a deal come out of these talks so that some sort of relief from sanctions would happen. But I also see other people who are very skeptical of if there is going to be a deal between Iran and the U.S. And second, even if there is a deal, will we experience the same thing that we experienced with JCPOA, where the U.S. unilaterally withdrew from the deal and sanctions were imposed again on Iran, and we basically gave up on uranium enrichment without getting anything in return. So mostly people are hoping that some sort of sanctions relief will happen so that it will feel the economy will start to bloom like it used to.
And I want to get to sanctions more in a moment, but this issue of uranium enrichment now seems to be at the heart of the discussions. U.S. now insists Iran must completely abandon enrichment. The Iranians are saying their nuclear work is entirely peaceful and enrichment is within their rights. Let's listen to Iran's Foreign Minister Abbas Araghchi.
No matter how many times American officials repeat it, it will not change the essence of the matter. Our position is completely clear. I have stated it clearly before and repeat it. Uranium enrichment in Iran will continue with or without an agreement.
Well, Iran certainly has said it has the right to retain domestic enrichment under the 1968 Non-Proliferation Treaty for energy and medical purposes. Satar, why is Iran enriching uranium at such a high level, though, well above what's required for civilian purposes?
Well, there's a debate if this is actually well above the civilian purposes, but better question to ask is why there are other countries who are having even higher levels of enrichment, but the U.S. does not care. Some countries in the region have already established stockpile of nuclear weapons, and neither the U.S. nor the so-called international community cares about that. Iran has the most severe inspection regime imposed on its nuclear activities and facilities by the International Atomic Agency. Iran has tried to prove time and again that its nuclear activity is within the peaceful the requirements for peaceful program, which will benefit the Iranian nation. But it's also about protecting Iran's sovereignty. Iran and a majority of Iranians, I would say, feel that their country has the right to pursue a nuclear program that can benefit the nation, and it is not, and the U.S. or any other country is not in a position to impose, beyond normal protocols or beyond internationally agreed treaties, inspection or limitations to Iran's nuclear program.
This enrichment issue is becoming a really big deal. Negar, let me turn to you. According to the IAEA, Iran has been enriching uranium to 60%, the only country without a nuclear weapon to do so. This is a huge jump from the 3.67% that was set in the 2015 agreement. As Satar rightfully mentioned, the U.S. administration abandoned that deal. How much of a problem is this issue with uranium enrichment? Could it derail the entire discussions? And do you see room for compromise?
Well, Iran has been using enrichment or sort of the expansion of a program as a major leverage. And as we see from the other side, and the Europeans and even the regional allies, it is actually a leverage because the other side is insisting so much on it. This is after the U.S. under President Trump first term pulled out of the nuclear deal that was made with Iran while Iran was complying. So this is an issue that Iran has used, has expanded the program, but also kept the door open. Sort of they didn't burn any bridges to scale back the program, and that's essentially why they're coming back to the negotiating table. Now, if we bring this to zero enrichment, which is something that some senior administration officials in the U.S. are pushing for, sort of the Libya model or the dismantlement of that enrichment program, that seems to be a red line, a non-starter for Iran. Just this week, the Iranian foreign minister and other officials have made it very clear that there will be no deal if there's zero enrichment. But if some level of, like you're saying, civilian enrichment by Iran can remain, then I think Iran seems to be open to configuring or meeting somewhere halfway with creative, ways and making concession on that issue. But zero enrichment seems to be a non-starter and sort of a poison pill that I think opponents of diplomacy are trying to insert in the process.
We also want to play a clip by U.S. Secretary of State Marco Rubio speaking to the Senate Foreign Relations Committee this week. Really, his tone rather conciliatory when he's talking about the path towards peace and reconciliation with Iran. Let's take a listen.
Our hope is that we can encourage them to show them a path towards prosperity and peace that allow them to develop their economy, that allow them, if they want, to have a civil nuclear energy program like other countries around the world have without enrichment. And it's our hope we can encourage them in that direction.
Amir, certainly it seems like the tone has changed, conciliatory, a softer tone. Is there any wiggle room for compromise? Is this an impasse that two sides can overcome?
Well, I think the tone has changed. It's because of President Trump, because they know that President Trump wants the deal. Marco Rubio, when he was in the Senate, was opposed to the JCPOA and was one of the biggest Iran hawks in the Senate and Congress. President Trump has kept his mind open and his options open. And it's interesting, Marco Rubio is not there negotiating with the Iranian foreign minister indirectly. It's Steve Witkoff. So that gives you a sense of how President Trump is playing this. I think there is room for compromise. I think, as Negar said, it's got to be some creative formula. But essentially, we're going down the path of something similar to the JCPOA with probably more stringent timelines, certain clauses of what Iran can and cannot do on enrichment probably won't sunset. And that's to get a sort of a more for more deal. If Iran and the US can't find a big compromise on this issue, then I think that they're going to look for an interim deal. I don't see both sides walking away from this because they both know what walking away from this means, especially with Israel continuing to make threats on attacking Iran's nuclear program.
Satar, let me turn to you. What's been the reaction there in Iran to reports in U.S. media that Israel is potentially making preparations to strike Iran if these negotiations fail?
Yes, that's certainly one of the topics that you can hear in public, but also among elites and academics, that they're saying that without a deal, it's very likely that Israel will go ahead and try to strike Iran's nuclear facilities. But at the same time, because of Iran's responses to Israeli aggression, especially during last year, they also have a great part of the society has come to believe that in case of a response or in case of a military action coming from Israel, Iran is going to, it's well prepared to respond to it, but definitely that's going to have severe impacts on the economy, but also on the lives of ordinary Iranians. So at the same time, while people are hoping that some sort of agreement will be signed between Iran and the U.S., and it will bring about sanctions, I think, especially because they don't want to have tension with any country or even with the Zionist entity. But at the same time, they believe that Iran should protect its sovereignty in case there is aggression from Israel. And I think we all know that this is at some point everyone thought that Trump would, or the U.S. government would probably support an Israeli aggression on Iran. But at this time, and with the negotiations going on, it looks like this is not what the U.S. wants, but it's a decision made solely by Israel, and it will have consequences not only for the Israeli regime, but also for U.S. because U.S. Occupation bases in the region will also come under attack
Understood.
if the U.S. decides to go along with that plan.
All right. Well, does Iran have a plan B if these talks don't go anywhere? Negar, first to you, and I want to ask Amir the same question.
Well, the plan B, as it looks like from the whole regional dynamic, is conflict. And I don't think that's something that Iran wants. It's not something that they've sort of been pushing for. It's also not something the U.S. wants. Poll after poll shows that the American public has no appetite for another big war in the Middle East that the U.S. gets dragged into. I think that's also the reason why President Trump, the vice president, are trying to stay away from that. But what I think the Iranians have signaled is that they are prepared for that plan B. They're prepared for conflict. The taboo of direct engagement with Israel has been broken. Iran has had back and forth with Israel directly from its soil twice in the past 2 years. And also they've made it very clear with diplomacy with their Arab neighbors around the Persian Gulf that if conflict happens, the flames of that fire will reach Saudi Arabia, UAE, Qatar. They've made it very clear, even Iraqis, everyone's afraid of sort of this potential endless conflict starting between the US and Iran. And nobody wants to see the consequences of that. It's bad for business, bad for investment. All these goals and ambitions that especially countries of the Persian Gulf area have. So their position, I think, is the game changer here. We see Saudi Arabia publicly pushing for a deal, which they didn't under Obama. They were in the sort of opposite or opposition to diplomacy. Same goes with other countries in the region. So really the only, I would say, strong opposition to US-Iran diplomacy right now seems to be Israel, which is very different from the last round of negotiations under President Obama, even during the Biden administration and also the first Trump term.
Amir, do you agree with Negar that Israel appears to be the only opponent here of these discussions?
I think the Europeans are not as freewheeling and as willing to deal with Iran as much as President Trump personally is. I think definitely, I agree with Negar that the regional dynamics are much different than they were in 2015, because back then it seemed as if, and it was as if, the region, the countries of the GCC, with the exception of maybe Oman and Qatar, were against the nuclear deal. Now you have Saudi and the UAE, Kuwait and Bahrain all coming out publicly for a compromise. But I actually see Iran's cards very limited if there is no deal. That's why I think they will try to go for some sort of interim deal, less for less. Because if the talks break down, what are Iran's options? Continue to enrich uranium beyond 60% to 70, 80, 90%, getting further down to weapons grade enrichment. That would surely invite a strike from Israel. And we all can imagine what that would look like. Yes, Iran would respond, but over time, that would mean, American satellites in the air, American assets in the air, and their second and third strike capabilities, will be greatly diminished because it'll be a confrontation not just with Israel, but with the United States.
We're also seeing a shift in Iran's regional influence with its proxies like Hamas and Hezbollah weekend, and of course the fall of the Assad regime in Syria. Does this give the United States perhaps more leverage, an upper hand? Amir, back to you.
I think so. I think Iran's proxy network has been severely weakened. It hasn't been obliterated. The Houthis are still there. They're still firing rockets into Israel. But Hezbollah has definitely been not dismantled, but severely weakened. And it seems as if the Lebanese government, along with the United States, have come in to continue to interdict on weapons transfers into Lebanon. Assad is no longer there. and the Iraqi government is exercising sovereignty that it hasn't before on a lot of the Shia militias. So, and that may be a good thing. That may pave the way for Iran and the U.S. to find a compromise, because Iran is, their government will look at the region and say, you know, our ability to inflict pain is less than it was before. Better to save face and have a deal than further escalate.
I got to ask about sanctions. Iranians are having trouble making ends meet. There's a lot of unemployment, triple-digit inflation. The value of rial has plummeted. Is there perhaps hope, and this is a question I also asked Ambassador Limbert, that these discussions, even if there's no major breakthrough, if there's some kind of temporary agreement, some kind of pause, some kind of movement, that perhaps by itself can give an opening and give some hope to Iranians who have been hurting for so many years? Negar.
I think so. I mean, sanctions relief and a boost to the economy is sort of the major driver here. Of course, also staying away from the path of conflict. It's something that the Iranians are really hoping for when you see sort of the general population. The hope level, I think, is less than, for example, when it was under JCPOA, because they've seen the ups and downs, and I don't know how positive the outlook is, but certainly a boosted economy, sanctions relief, opening the doors to more investment and foreign trade, any form of opening for a country that's been so isolated politically, economically, and that has really impacted the population severely. I think that would be sort of the major driver, and also depending on what the U.S. is able and willing to offer.
There is such a lack of trust between Iran and the United States. I mean, considering the Trump administration did pull out of JCPOA, Satar, the trust issue is also a big one. Iranians don't trust the Americans don't trust the Iranians.
Well, that's true. But before tapping on that issue, let me just make a very quick point to the audience that calling Hamas and Hezbollah Iran's proxies will actually take credit and agency away from Palestinians and Lebanese who voted for Hamas in Gaza and for Hezbollah in Lebanon. But yes, this issue of lack of trust between the Iran and U.S. has always existed, but since Trump unilaterally withdrew from an Obama-signed deal last time, it has become even more serious issues, because a lot of Iranians are now talking about, even if we reach a deal, what if the same thing that happened to JCPOA will happen to a new deal? And I think as long as there is no mechanism inside the U.S. government, maybe the U.S. Congress or House, that will prevent any president from unilaterally withdrawing from an internationally signed deal, this lack of trust will exist, especially between Iran and the U.S., but also for other countries in the world who would want to do deal with the U.S., because we know that U.S. has, I mean, the JCPOA is not the only international treaty that the U.S. has breached. The U.S. has on several occasions, especially with the Trump administration, abandoned international.
Well, yeah, I mean, that is an important point here. Even if there is an agreement, Amir and Negar, who knows what's going to happen? The next administration might dismantle that agreement. So, I mean, Iran may want some certain guarantees here.
Well, that's something they tried under the Biden administration, but I think they also understand the complexities of the U.S. system. Really, this reversal that Satar is talking about is true. So, I mean, if this goes into the U.S. Congress as a treaty, of course, that would be at the next level up from JCPOA, a much bigger achievement. And maybe President Trump is actually able of getting something out of the Republican Congress. If there's anyone, it would be him. If not, I think the Iranians are also looking at sort of a model that is within the presidency. So you sign with the president, and that remains within the presidency, and then God knows what comes after. I think that's also another sort of understanding or expectation that has come after the pullout of the JCPOA and the failure of returning to it, even under the next Democratic president, which was Joe Biden.
A lot to talk about. I appreciate all of you being on the program. Thank you very much. That's it for this edition of The Heat. I'm Asiye Namdar in Washington. Thank you for watching.